Hello and welcome to Enor's Fireside Chat on GDPR, Google Analytics, and more. We're excited to share some key information on this industry hot topic, especially as it relates to Google Analytics. Today I want to introduce some of my co-presenters. I'm with Sri Chalasani, our reporting consultant, Enor's principal consultant and co-founder, Feras Alhlou, and I'm Josh Kattinger, VP of Product and Marketing at Enor. Before we go too deep into this, we want to make clear that while we are talking about GDPR, it is a legal matter, and our lawyers wanted us to remind you that we are not providing any legal advice in this process. So Sri and Feras, just want to say hello to you guys real quick.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for the introduction.
Hi, Josh. Thank you.
I'm glad we have friendly lawyers. Yes. All right.
Yeah, well, you know, the lawyers do love GDPR, Feras. It generates lots of business. So I guess we can start off with really the first thing is just an overview. What is GDPR and why is it such a big deal? Why is it all the rage in the analytics industry?
Thanks, Josh. I think everyone these days, they've heard of GDPR. And as the EU GDPR.org site, it says it's the most important change in the data privacy regulation in 20 years. So it is significant. But, you know, we have, I think, organizations hopefully have been preparing for it. If not, hopefully there's some time to get ready. But there's increasing awareness of, you know, the massive amount of data that organizations have on individuals. You know, one of the questions is, you know, who's responsible? You know, how responsible are they with this data? So one thing we want to keep in mind is, especially as we hear about data breaches almost every other week, is you know, be aware of as organizations, as marketers, be aware of this regulation. And what the GDPR does is it's an attempt. It's from the EU, and it's their attempt to answer you know, some of these concerns, and documenting the rights of citizens and laying out the responsibilities of the organizations. And you know, the second part of your question, Josh, in terms of why should people care? You know, I'm busy. Well, there are a lot of reasons that people should care. One is that is the penalties. You know, you can read on the side. There's some significant penalties to organizations who would be out of compliance. But in addition to that, I think the most important aspect is more of a in a long-term nature, is that we all should recognize the importance of collecting and using data on individuals, and we should be using it responsibly. So with this growing awareness on this topic, I think you know, it's expected that similar requirements, legal and operational, will be adopted beyond the EU. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not big on making predictions, but it is some of the elements here. A lot of it is common sense. I know there's a lot of process, a lot of procedures, a lot of paperwork, but we all marketers and folks with access to personal data, if we're not compliant, if we're not using this data responsibly, there might be a public backlash that could actually be of concern to all involved.
Just ask Mark Zuckerberg, right?
Yes, we know he's busy in DC last few days.
Okay, so that certainly makes sense. I guess moving on to the next logical step is, with respect to Google Analytics 360 and GDPR, the roles that are defined in the GDPR, there's the data controller and the data processor. In the world of Google Analytics, where Enor is a reseller of GA360, we have a customer who buys GA360. How do those roles work with respect to GDPR? Our client, us as the reseller, and Google as the manufacturer of the product. How does that work?
So, Shri, do you want to comment a bit on the definitions, and then I'll comment on the contractual aspect?
Sure. So we've heard these terms over and over again in the last few months. Data controller is someone who collects the data from end users. and also determines the purpose for which the data is being processed. Now, these are the ones who are actually making all the decisions about how the data is being processed. And the data processor is someone who's just processing the personal data on behalf of the controller after receiving written instructions from them. And GDPR is really quite specific in terms of the roles and responsibilities of both the controllers and the processors, and in fact mandates that there should be a contract in writing called a data processing agreement, or a DPA, between the controller and the processor, identifying what is being processed, the duration of the processing, the type of personal data being processed, and the obligations and rights of both the parties. And this needs to be in place before the processor can actually start processing the personal data on behalf of the controller. And first, if you want to talk about, who's the processor or the controller with respect to GA360.
Sure. Thank you, Shri. And I think we'll all get comfortable with these terms as we have to see them in contracts and speak with folks about them. But from a legal, like I said, GA360 perspective, you have a couple options. You can buy directly from Google, or you buy from a reseller. So in the case, if you bought from Enor, this applies to other resellers as well. If you bought the license from a reseller, the reseller, in this case for us, Enor, is the processor, and then Google will be a sub-processor. So the end client is the client that has GA installed on their site, on their apps. They're collecting data. They're determining what's being collected. So they are the controller. And then between the data collector, the end client, and the reseller, there should be a DPA. And you should definitely check with your reseller to get a copy of their DPAs and review it with your legal team. And of course, between resellers and Google, DPAs are or will be in place depending, on where the reseller is at with their compliance. So again, for Enor clients, we should be reaching out to you if we haven't let us know to get the DPAs in place, or for again the folks who are out there working with other resellers, check with your reseller about the DPA. But to summarize, there should be a data processing agreement between all parties involved. And I'll add to that, now if you've contracted directly with Google, again, this is one of the options in terms of acquiring a license. And I'm not speaking on behalf of Google, but just to help those who are listening to this webinar. Google will operate as a processor. Actually, that will be the case in both Google Analytics free standard and Google Analytics 360. So Google will be the processor, and you'll if you've contracted with Google directly on GA360, follow up with your Google account manager regarding the terms and the DPAs. But the two options: if you're with a reseller, speak with your reseller. If you're with Google Direct, this is on the GA360, the paid version, the enterprise version. That's where the contracts are in place. On the free product, you can just read some of the articles and some of the compliance documentation that Google has shared publicly.
And in the scenario where Google wants to communicate with customers about GDPR, specifically GA360 customers, how do they do that?
So if the client, let's say Enor is, don't want to confuse the reseller here, but the client would reach out to the account manager. So Google would have an account executive or an account manager, and the person, so the company, the organization should reach out to their account manager. All right. And one more thing I'll also add, and around the Suite Home, I think Josh, we were getting some of those questions about communicating. Back to your question about communicating with Google. There's also a formal process, and maybe that's what you were alluding to earlier, Josh. Within the GA360 Suite Home, if you haven't logged in recently, you'll log in under your organization settings. You'll see this data processing amendment DPA, And you also, if you haven't filled out the information for the purpose of the webinar, we have it here for you. You click on this and you'll see the data that you have to enter. Basically, all customers in the scope of the GDPR, the European Economic Area, EEA, we sometimes say EU, there's a slight, I guess, differentiation there. If you're Iceland, I believe you're under the EEA, but basically, if you're a customer within the scope of the GDPR, you are required to provide a contact that can be reached for all the contractually mandated notices, updates, and maintenance of the GDPR compliance. So, and this is specific to Google Analytics, but if you have other providers, other technology vendors, they're probably similar processes. But as it relates to GA, Google Analytics, you must specify at least one contact, as the primary contact within your organization. And I know it's difficult if you're a multinational, global organization, who's going to be this contact person. That could be a challenge, but that's maybe some of the thought process could within your organization on who should be contacted and what notification processes should be in place.
I think more and more larger organizations are going to have specific roles that are specific to that, right?
Exactly, and we talked about, I don't know if we'll get to it on this webinar, but in terms of
hiring a data protection officer,
data protection officer, or assign there's specific requirements for the DPO, but if not a DPO, maybe at least someone, like a data protection lead.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that would be definitely a good practice.
Makes sense. So we've talked about from the compliance side and the things that we as a reseller in Google and our customers are going to have to do. But Shri, I know you've been looking into on the end user side, what are some of the rights that users get granted under GDPR?
Yep. So GDPR, as you all know, is about actually protecting personal data. And all users or data subjects, as they would like to call us, are granted some basic rights with respect to how the personal data is actually treated and managed. Let's talk about like a few of those rights as you see them on the screen. Under GDPR, users have a right to know what personal data is being processed, how the data is being processed, and the purpose for which it is being processed. And users also have a right to object if the personal data that is being processed is for marketing purposes, or if they can object if there are any other legitimate grounds to do so. And the most important thing is, in case of inaccurate or incomplete personal data, which can be a problem, the individual can request that the data be corrected. And you can also restrict or block processing of personal data in certain scenarios. And another very important right that is being granted under GDPR for users is the right to be forgotten, or the right to erasure, where the users can ask that their personal data be erased from the systems if it is no longer required, or if the processing seems to be illegal or unlawful. And with these rights, GDPR is actually trying to give users more control over their personal data.
Right. And again, this is top of mind. We're hearing about it in the news, so very timely.
Yeah, so that's a good overview of those rights. Feras, I don't know, can you go into a little bit of depth on how Google is ensuring that each of those are met?
Right, thanks, Josh. And we have a slide here. There are things that happen behind the scene, and Google has been the forefront of this. For months now, we've seen, if you follow their privacy statements and their privacy guidelines and data security policies and the compliance with the various ISO standard, the 27001 and others. So there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes type responsibilities around technology and around data security that are taking place, are in place to maintain records and to ensure data privacy and security. But there are also other mechanisms that are needed to be provided to the data collectors. So to what Shri was saying, to Shri's point earlier, and we'll cover this in a couple of slides here about the right to be forgotten, or about, knowing what is, been done with your data. That's, I think, where Google's also, that's where Google's also presenting some feature enhancements to the product so that data collector, data controllers can be in compliance.
Makes sense. So,
and sorry, just one last thing is if you go to the EU user consent policy, this is important to note for our European listeners and clients and friends, is that there will be an update to the EU user consent policy. So keep an eye on this page and on communication from Google over the next few weeks.
Okay, so I assume that means in order to implement these policies correctly, there have been some changes or updates in both Google Analytics Free and Google Analytics 360 in order to allow compliance. Is that true?
That is correct, and I think a lot of the folks I know, including folks here at Enor, received emails from Google over the last little bit. And basically, there are some specific product enhancements, especially around relating to the right to be forgotten. There are two of them specifically, one around data retention controls and one about user deletion tools. So specifically as it relates to data retention controls, there's actually a help article now under data privacy and security, where starting May 25th, that's the date that we have to keep in mind, user and event data will be retained in your account according to the settings that you have, and you'll see some of the settings here on the screen: 14 months, 26 months, 38 months, and so on. So Google Analytics, according to your setting, will automatically delete user and event data that is older than the retention period that you select. So if you selected maybe a 26-month period, then anything beyond 26 months in terms of user and event data will be deleted. There's also a note in that help article about the aggregated data. So the settings here will not affect reports based on aggregated data. Since the aggregated tables are the standard reports and are based on non-personal data, they can be retained in an anonymized, form for reporting purposes. All of us will see this in action as we get closer to May 25th, but this is what has been shared with us and with GA users in general.
So I'll still have my high-level traffic data that isn't affected by this. I'll still have my high-level page views, sessions, users, etc.
Correct. So yeah, aggregated data, the aggregated table, what you see in the UI in terms of the aggregated data. Sorry, that will not be affected. Correct. The second component, or the second product update, is the user deletion tool. So this is where back to the right to be forgotten. This is where the tool will allow us to manage the deletion of all the data associated with an individual user. Again, this applies to both GA and GA 360. And obviously, there's some common identifiers that are sent to analytics in the form of maybe the first party cookie, the client ID, or potentially if you have user ID enabled, or if you have in the mobile world the app instance ID, if using Firebase. So more details will be provided by Google on their developer site, but the idea is that there will be a mechanism to allow for user data deletion. And maybe just a quick follow-up. We won't go into the details of each one of these, but I love the word data subject. This is all of us. We are data subject. But these are tools that Google has made available, some of it for a long time, around the ad settings, what you see, opting out of ads, and even opting out of GA, being tracked in GA. So those links will make those available when we post the webinar, but those are available resources for us.
Okay. Sound like a good time to do some frequently asked questions on GDPR?
All right.
So what are some of the responsibilities of controllers under GDPR?
So, as we said earlier, controllers, typically in organizations who are, if you're a head of marketing and you purchase GA360 and you work with your team to deploy the tags on your sites and apps, you're instructing, you're configuring the software to collect that data. So collectors do have a lot of responsibilities. Basically, they need to make sure that they enable all of the data subjects rights. So all the rights that Shri covered a little bit ago, we want to make sure controllers can enable those rights. They also need to have a contract in place with data processors. So we mentioned the data processing agreement (DPA) in previously. So that needs to be in place, and that will and to ensure that the data processors are using we're meeting the requirements that are listed under GDPR. So keeping track of your records, documenting your processes, training your staff, having data protection checklist, potentially having a chief data
protection officer,
or a code of conduct. Again, some of these big words. Again, you can review the content on the website. But some of these, I think we were discussing this internally for Enor. Some of it is just common sense. When in terms of have a policy around backup, around passwords, around training. Training your team and maybe do a quarterly audit. So some of these, reporting, incident reporting is an important aspect of GDPR. What happens if there's a breach or if there's a cybersecurity incident, as I hear it at times. So these are just good processes to have in place. And at the end of the day, it's going to require some time and attention from all of us, which I know maybe. We're all busy trying to, meet the demands of the business, but it's something that we have to be aware of and embrace.
You've mentioned a couple of times this DPA, the data processing agreement. As it relates to Google Analytics 360, will Google enter into a DPA with an end customer?
So to be specific, if the customer has purchased the license, the GA360 license from a reseller, no. The end client will establish a DPA with the reseller. So that's to be clear. If you have again a bought directly from Google, then yeah, Google will work with you on those agreements.
That makes sense. One of the favorite features of Google Analytics 360 Suite is the ability to export hit-level data from GA360 into Google's BigQuery product. Where does BigQuery stand on complying with GDPR?
Right. So on BigQuery, and there's a lot of raw data there, right? So just a quick background. So if you have GA360, there's a native integration where the raw data, the hit level data, timestamp sequence data flows into BigQuery. That's just fully, in a fully automated fashion. So with that integration, the GA data is sent to BigQuery, and at times, you use it with other data to stitch different data sources, maybe your CRM data with GA data, maybe your ad data with your GA data. So the BigQuery team at Google and a lot of actually they're, I think, ahead of the curve. They published a lot of documentation, made a lot of strong statements in support of GDPR and compliance with the various standards. And we would recommend that you check with those links. So again, you have, if you're collecting the data, you're the data controller. You're pushing this data to the BigQuery. You have have a responsibility, as we discussed previously. From a Google perspective, the processor, or if you have a third party in the middle, maybe Google is a sub-processor. Again, their compliance around like the ISO certifications and all the security and protection items we mentioned earlier.
And how does, my notes were a little out of order here, how does the Google Ads data processing terms relate to the terms that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think this is, we might have this one out of sequence. We have, again, in terms of, we've shared those links earlier in terms of folks opting out. And if you go, if you are, this is specific again, because we do a lot of work with GFU60 clients, we're one of the leading resellers. So if you're an end client of a reseller, and even if you go and make some, make those edits in the interface, your DPA is still with your reseller, basically. That's what we're trying to point out here. So if you contracted with an organization, the DPA has to be established between you and that organization. So in that sense, Google is not entering that agreement with you, even though you might be making those updates in the interface within the suite.
Makes sense. And following on the BigQuery question, what about Firebase, the mobile analytics component?
Yeah, and that's thank you, Josh. And that's similar to, and we'll make those links actually available in after we publish the webinar. Similar to BigQuery, the Firebase team has also made some strongly committed to GDPR and has set their own pages and demonstrating how they're compliant. And again, for those maybe who haven't been introduced to Firebase, especially around analytics, Firebase analytics is what you use for mobile app tracking. So we'd recommend that you review both the link here for Firebase as well as the one for BigQuery. And like I said, both teams at Google has made statement with their strong commitment to GDPR.
And how does where the analytics data actually gets stored relate to GDPR, and where does Google store all of our analytics data?
Now, as a reseller, this is a question that we often get asked again and again. Where is our Google Analytics data? As you can see from the image in front of you, majority of the data centers are located in North America in the south, and followed by Europe. There are a few in Asia, and we have one data center, and they have one data center in South America. I think barring Africa and Australia, there's pretty much a data center in every continent.
Right, and there's a link here in terms of, I mean, this is commonly asked questions if you work in the U.S. with government agencies, or sometimes, again, working with European clients, there are certain guidelines around hosting the data in country. So far, I think from our experience working with, and there's an option in terms of storing the data in the EU. So from our experience working with IT folks and data security folks, once they look at the compliance, Google and its track record, and in terms of compliance around data security and data protection, it hasn't been a big issue as of now. Maybe after May 25th, things will change, but I think Google has done a good job in terms of sharing what they've done around privacy and data security and where the data is stored. Not sure. I'm not saying that the data security folks will give you a quick pass by just sharing this link, but I think if you engage them, especially if you're a marketer and trying to deploy some technology, especially Google technology, I think sharing the information that Google has made publicly, has made public, I think that can help your case internally as well.
All right. Well, I think we've, in this short time, kind of hit the high notes on GDPR and covered some of the main basic concepts. If people want to get more information on GDPR, there's certainly no shortage of information. But on our next slide here, and as Feras mentioned, we're going to embed this webinar into a blog post on enor.com, and we will have these series of resources available, the links throughout the document, so that folks can go to these. Feras, did you want to comment on any of these resources before we wrap up?
No, I think, thank you, Josh. I think those, you'll see the title is self-explanatory. You'll see useful information. We are getting, I would say, a lot of questions around, contracts time, renewals, or just, folks in the industry asking, what's going on, what's Google doing about GDPR. So hopefully this webinar, you found it helpful and informative, and more details can be found here, or just send us a comment on the blog post and we'll be happy to answer.
All right. Feras, Shri, thank you very much for your time. We hope you found this helpful, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.